Hello, welcome to InfoFire, the fireside chat series from Information Matters. InfoFire brings together visionary thinkers and leading experts from diverse fields to share their stories, insights, and perspectives. InfoFire is a pioneering hybrid format that blends biography and scholarship. We aim to draw out the stories behind the science, illuminating the personal, intellectual, and the societal undercurrents that shape our evolving information landscape. Our goal is to blend the personal and the professional, offering a unique fusion of academic depth and narrative warmth. I am Shalini R, your host for this series. I am an academic with over 4 decades of experience in teaching and researching in the field of information. I also founded 2 educational institutions: the International School of Information Management, India's first iSchool at the University of Mysore, and the Myra School of Business, also in Mysore, India. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Michael Buckland, a luminary in the field of information science, as our guest. Let me take a few minutes to introduce our guest of the day. An Emeritus professor at the University of California, Berkeley School of Information, Dr. Buckland career has profoundly influenced our understanding of information systems, library services, and the very nature of information itself. Buckland's academic journey began in England, where he trained at Oxford's Bodleian Library and earned his PhD from the University of Sheffield. His early work at Lancaster University focused on library management and book availability, leading to significant contributions in library science. In 1972, he moved to the United States, eventually joining the Berkeley's School of Library and Information Studies. During his time at the University of California, Dr. Buckland served as the Dean of School of Library and Information Studies from 1976 to 84, as well as Assistant Vice President for Library Plans and Policies with the UC Office of the President from 1983 to 87. At UCP Information School, he led research in libraries, information retrieval, translingual search, bibliographic and metadata services, the history and theory of documentation, digital libraries, and the representation of cultural heritage institutions. He holds the distinction of being one of the most heavily cited authors in the field of library information science, and his scholarship spans nearly 60 years. His scholarly impact is reflected in a H-index of 38 with over 13,000 citations to his work. As Emeritus Professor, he coordinates the long-running Friday afternoon information access seminar at the School of Information. In addition to his service at the University of California, Dr. Buckland has worked at Purdue University as well as visiting positions in Austria, Australia, and Sweden. In 1989, he won the distinction of being a Fulbright Research Scholar at the Graz University of Technology in Austria. He is perhaps best known for his seminal 1991 article, Information as Thing, where he delineates 3 distinct concepts of information: as process, as knowledge, and as thing. This work has become foundational in information science, emphasizing the tangible aspects of information and their implications for information systems. Another seminal conceptual contribution by Buckland is his analysis of the concept of document and his work on document theory and documentality. Buckland's extensive bibliography includes influential works such as Book Availability and the Library User, published in 1975, Library Services in Theory and Context, 1983, Information and Information Systems, 1991, Redesigning Library Services, 1992, Emanuel Goldberg and His Knowledge Machine, 2006, Information and Society in 2017, which received the ACCT Best Information Science Book of the Year award in 2018. He also has written another book published in 2021, Ideology and Libraries, California, Diplomacy and Occupied Japan. Buckland's contributions have been recognized with numerous honors, including the ACCT Award of Merit in 2012, the highest honor in the field, the Frederick Kilgore Award for Research in Library and Information Technology in 2014, the ACCT Best Information Science Book Award in 2018, induction into the California Library Hall of Fame in 2021. Beyond his writings, Buckland co-directed the Electronic Cultural Atlas Initiative, integrating cultural heritage with digital technologies. Join us as we delve into a conversation with Michael Buckland, exploring the evolution of knowledge, libraries, and the ideological dimensions of information in our society. Hello, welcome to InfoFire. We are really honored to have you with us, Professor Michael Buckland. Welcome.
It's a pleasure.
Today, we have the distinct honor of hosting a pioneer and a living legend in the field of information science, that is Professor Michael Buckland, whose scholarship and leadership has shaped every aspect, every facet of information science, from foundational aspects to the professional and practical aspects, as well as historical inquiry. So today, in this session, we are going to have a conversation with Professor Michael Buckland on almost every aspect of the field of information science, starting with his, I would say, seminal contribution to the foundations of information science with his Information as Thing and Document Theory, to his book, Information and Society, as well as to one of his latest recent books, that is Ideology and Libraries. He has worked on various, as I mentioned earlier, various aspects of information science. So we are going to make a small change in our usual format. Instead of intervening in between and asking questions on all these aspects, I have already shared the questions with Professor Michael Buckland, and he is going to be talking about all of these aspects, right from information as thing to information and society, and especially his historical inquiry into Goldberg's contribution to information science, or the technology of information. So over to you, Michael. Could you tell us something more about your theories and your work?
Well, thank you. You sent me this list of questions and I will work through them. I think it was a good idea to start with the notion of information as thing, and maybe at the end we'll get to thing as information. The origin of the information as thing paper goes back to the transition of my school at Berkeley from a respectable school of librarianship to a wide-ranging school of information. And what happened was that at Berkeley, academic departments get reviewed every several years. And this is a very serious matter. It's a campus review. And it can literally mean life or death for the department. So it has to be taken seriously. And in 1973, a committee was appointed to review the School of Librarianship, which had originated earlier in the century. And the following year, in 1974, a report was issued. It's known familiarly as the Wheeler Report, and it can be found on the school's website if you're interested. And it was a very interesting report. It said, well, training good librarians to work in libraries is a very good thing. But other schools are doing that, plenty of them. And in the meanwhile, there are some important developments going on, including the fact that computers have been invented And that's going to have a huge impact. They didn't quite know what the impact might be, but it was going to be big. And the school had better prepare for it. But more interestingly was the thought that although libraries have problems organizing documents for use, and although you've got lots of librarians and lots of schools of librarianship, you have the same problem outside of libraries, where everybody's drowning in documents and data in all kinds of contexts, and nobody's paying attention to that. And if you're going to be on a research campus, you'd better be concerned with research and exploration and ideas and theories. And it's a mistake to concentrate only on one kind of institution, libraries. So the school had better be concerned with the marking and the parking of documents and data for folks to use in any context. And there's a special, huge social, political, technical need to do this outside of libraries as well as inside. So the school had better diversify its interests. It's sort of, one might say, to diversify the product line if you were talking about manufacturing. And the dean had, the then dean had decided he'd had enough deaning. Now, so they would look for a new one, and everybody agreed with this report. There was really no dissent. And I got recruited to come to Berkeley to facilitate this transition. It was my first time in a school. I'd always worked in libraries before. And I didn't bring a plan. I didn't have a plan, but I knew planning was important. And so how are we going to do this? And what happened was rather interesting. We said, well, look, let's think about what happens in libraries and how we deal with it. Libraries are institutions, and you have librarians doing clever things inside. And this school prepares librarians, but it also thinks about library science and tries to theorize it. So what would happen if we looked at a library-like situation outside of libraries? You could imagine archives, or you could do corporate record management, and databases are springing up all over the place. One development of that time was that law firms were getting very interested in controlling the masses of evidence they had. And a big law firm has a problem of not getting wound up representing both sides of the same case, conflicts of interest. And so we thought about this. And the people who taught cataloging said, well, we don't know what happens in records management, but if they're dealing with documents, they're going to catalog them. So this is full employment for us. And the people concerned with classification said, well, if you've got data or documents, you have to organize them in some sense. So whatever we do, it has to include the application of classification. And the people who are interested in the politics and economics of library service said, well, you're going to have politics and economics everywhere. And the specialist in government documents said, well, if you're in a large firm or a government department, you really have to know the government regulations. So any such program is going to have to take my class. And it was seen very positively as full employment for everybody. And in effect, this meant that it wasn't threatening. It was an opportunity for everybody. So it was a very positive move. And in addition, we had more so-called information scientists per square foot than any other school at that time. And while we weren't very clear what that meant, it certainly included theorizing. And the intent was that they would think interesting thoughts about library services, and librarians, if they had a problem, could ask them for help. Now, if you're going to theorize, you need problems. And so if you're going to open up other contexts, they're going to have different problems, or maybe they've got the same problem in a slightly different form. So this meant that all of a sudden, there was a whole new rich array of challenges for the people who thought they wanted to do theory. So it was an altogether very positive development, although it did worry our alumni. They feared that we were going to neglect library land. That was a reasonable fear, but we tried to persuade them that no, the original founder of this school, good old Sidney Mitchell, this is what he would have done now. Now, we didn't explain this very well to the rest of the campus, and we were really focused on the library profession and reassuring them. But that's what we did. And at that time, the archival profession was not ready for a decent education. They are now, but they weren't then. So we were more interested in databases and corporate records management, which deals with records that are not yet archival. Now, although that all seemed very good, I worried about this because I had two worries about it. And after 4 years, I had sabbatical leave, and I went to the Austrian Alps and sat and thought about the problems. The two problems were, one, it bothered me that the faculty weren't very interested in each other's work. I felt they ought to be. If this is a coherent field, and if it's a coherent school, they should be interested, I felt. And they really weren't. That was one problem. And the other was we'd engaged in this strategic move of huge import, but it would be an exaggeration to say we'd really thought through the implications of what we were doing. We were doing it with great confidence and enthusiasm, but it wasn't really theorized. So instead of doing the work I planned to do on my sabbatical, I thought I'd better fuss with these two problems. And I did it, as sometimes helps, thinking by writing. I tried to write little essays just for myself about any aspect of these two problems. And I concluded that they were the same problem. What they were was, how do the pieces fit together? What's the nature of this, what we're doing, as a coherent whole, a system? And how does it fit into the context that we operate in? And so I never did get to the work I intended to do. I sat down in the Austrian Alps and I wrote out of the top of my head my account of how library services were related to each other and to the environment in which they operate. I like to say that me and Einstein start with a special theory and then get to the general theory later. And I published it under the title Library Services in Theory and Context. And the intent all along was that this was a trial. This was a probe. This was looking at a particular case. If I could work through a coherent account of library services that included everything, then I could try it on the more general case of the genus, of the different species of document-based collections. But it was all I could do to do that in the few months I had on libraries, and it had to wait for a second sabbatical. In 1988, my wife and I went slowly around the world, and I occupied my time writing. And it was in Australia. We went to the University of New South Wales, and where I wrote the more general case of library-like, if you will, organizations. I wanted to include archives and records management and databases, but also museum collections. And there was a problem in doing that. And it was a very simple problem. And that is, what do you call the stuff you're dealing with? I mean, you can't get more basic than that. See, in the first book on library services in theory and context, you can just say, well, library materials.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to generalize to corporate record systems and museums, you can't say library materials. So what do you say? I mean, it's just a very simple word problem. So the obvious word was information. But the problem with the word information is that so many people have used it in so many different ways. It's a bad word. It ought to be abolished. Then people might have to say what they mean. And so a very simple writing problem. What do I call the stuff we're dealing with? And then I worried about this. We had an apartment looking out over the Pacific near Sydney. And I thought, well, let's try to sort it out a bit. And so in my mind, I thought about all the different ways in which people had used the character string information. And it occurred to me that if you sorted them out, most of them, not all, most of them would be in one of three different piles. Now, one pile would be when people refer to information, they mean books and bytes and bits and clay tablets and the stuff on the shelves and on the drives. There's a lot of information in that library. But English language words ending in A-T-I-O-N are almost always thoroughly ambiguous. Think of communication, regulation, foundation. They can all mean a process, or they can mean a thing, or they can mean an outcome. The foundation of your university, the foundation of your school, the foundation of your house, the foundation as a process. You know, they're different. So information is a bad word. So what are we going to do? Well, you can do two things, and I did both. One is, from that day on, I preferred the word document if I'm talking about a material object. And the other thing is, I said, well, okay, well, let's go with the flow. The word information can mean is widely used to mean three different things. Note that I didn't attempt to define. I'm just saying this is how the word is used. It's an observation. It's a language issue. And so one is information as thing, meaning books and bytes and stuff. And another is information as knowledge in your head. If you say, I have the information in my head, I remember it. A more formal term for that would be knowledge imparted, what you've learned or what you believed. So that's a kind of knowledge, and it's inside the skull. And I guess there's some neurological material aspect to it, but it's quite different from books and bytes and tape drives and thumb drives and stuff. But also, because of its A-T-I-O-N at the end, it can be a process that's not so common with information as it is with regulation and communication, but it's a possibility. I felt a lot better having sorted that out. And so I incorporated that in my second magnum opus on the cause and cure and nature and coherence and environment of all kind of the family, a kind of comparative anatomy of collection-based information services. And as I worked on the book, which was published as Information and Information Systems, I thought, well, I had to think about this. Maybe other people have the same difficulty, or they might. So maybe I should pick out the little bits and pieces from the book about the three different ways the word is used and put that as an article. It might interest people. And then I said, no, it's so obvious. It really shouldn't be offered for publication. But then I thought, well, you had to worry, I said to myself, so maybe other people would be interested. So I sent it in, and of course, that's what got all the attention, not the book. So that's the origin, a very specific origin. It's been misunderstood for two reasons. One is because people often thought I was defining, which I wasn't. I was just talking about the way the words are used. And the other is there's a problem with information as thing as to whether you're talking about a thing as information. And I'll get to that at the end. Because what I said was almost anything might be regarded as informative in some imaginable circumstance. You can't say with any confidence that there's anything that might not be regarded as informative in some conceivable circumstances. So if that's the case, then anything at all might conceivably, theoretically, potentially be information. And if everything might be, then it's not clear what you're saying. Anyway, so that is the origin of that. And I had a very...
If I may ask a question at this point of time.
Go ahead, anytime.
Okay. When you say information as thing, or document for that matter, I understand your discourse on that, but don't you think that it kind of excludes information as a process? Because if you call it a document, you are talking about the record or the outcome. Whereas, of course, I agree with you that when you say information as knowledge in the heads or minds of people, then that's a dynamic one.
Yes. No, I'm not ruling out any of these. I'm just saying that there are three. The word has been used in these three different ways. And what the word refers to exists. I mean, there is a process of becoming informed. In the book, I use the phrase becoming informed. And that's really important. What you call it is a separate issue. There's a problem in our field, as in other fields. People get confused between the name of things and the actual thing itself, and you really have to make an effort to keep them separate. So I wasn't excluding that in any way. Becoming informed is the key to what we do. And then what we know or believe, information as knowledge, that's terribly important. They're just different. They're just different, and they all need a lot of respect. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to include museums. I love to go to little museums. And but in the 1980s, what passed for theory and concepts and terminology in information science was not ready to consider museum objects as being a kind of information. And so I didn't know what to do that, and I was too stubborn to give up on museums. So that was a sticking point. And it so happened that I was at that time also working as a coordinator for library services for the 100 campuses of the 9 universities. And I went past, I had 2 offices, and I walked between the 2. And I happened to visit a museum of vertebrate zoology. And while I was there, I opened a drawer, and inside was a whole lot of dead birds, woodpeckers mainly. And I gazed at this and I said, how come when space is so scarce, the University of California is using prime campus space to store dead birds? I mean, it's nonsense. It's irrational. But a wise man once said to me, Michael, if you don't understand, if you think something is irrational, it's just you don't know what the rationale is. So what could the rationale be? And I thought, well, these birds, these dead birds, are collected in a university, and a university is concerned with teaching, with learning, with teaching and doing research. And so let's suppose that the dead birds are meant to assist with the learning, with the teaching and the research. In that case, I, as a librarian, can see that they're no different from the books on the shelves in the libraries. They've just got feathers on and they're in a tray instead of on a shelf. So these dead birds are documents in the same way as the volumes on the shelves. And so anybody who didn't run away fast enough would be given a lecture on dead birds as documents. Fortunately for the residents of Berkeley, I then went off on sabbatical to Australia. And the first thing I did was to go to the head of the library school there, Boyd Raywood, and I immediately started lecturing him on dead birds as documents. And he said, stop, stop, stop. And he handed me a piece of paper. He said, read that. And it was my idea, written down, printed, except it was in French and it was 40 years earlier. And it was about live antelopes as documents rather than dead birds. But I mean, you know, what's the difference? It's the same sort of thing. And this was a little pamphlet by a librarian called Suzanne Brier, and she'd had my idea. Once again, my best ideas had been had by somebody else before me. And that
Great
was startling.
think alike, right?
And so when I got back, I found that reinforcing. I wasn't the only person to think of this. When I got back, I started to read the rest of what she had written, and then other people. Her pamphlet was 1951, and it was part of the so-called documentation movement. Paul Otley and other people. And I felt that I had this, like an archaeologist that had discovered a lost world. And at that time, nobody in information, almost nobody, except Boyd Raywood, had any interest in the history of information science. So I got involved with the ACIS, special interest group on the history of, on the foundations of information science, and Bob Williams and I converted that into history and foundations. Anyway, so that's what got me on to one particularly intriguing case, and that was that at that time there was a cult of celebrating an engineer called Vannevar Bush as the father of information science, and this is clearly nonsense. And the more that I learned about the past before 1945, the clearer it was that this was nonsense. And one day I got so irritated by yet another invocation of Vannevar Bush. I noted that when people cited him, they never cited anybody else or any account of him, just his famous essay, as we may think. So I thought, I'm going to find the rest of the story. I'm a librarian. I'm going to do it.
Okay.
So I went over to the library with the sole mission of finding the rest of the story. And I had no idea where to start, except I did recall that Robert Fairthorne had written a critical essay on Fairthorne about Bush. That is unusual. So I traced the article. Fairthorne writes very knowledgeably and very cleverly. And he said, well, none of these ideas aren't new, and he doesn't understand what he's talking about. And in any case, his notion of a memics is based on an attempt, which was unsuccessful in the end, to have an optical device to search microfilm. It had nothing to do with computers or networks. And then he says, a similar device appears to have been developed by a Dr. E. Goldberg of the Zeiss Company in 1930, which is 15 years earlier than Bush's article. So the question, well, who was this Goldberg, and what Zeiss Company, and what did he do, and who knew? I spent on and off 15 years having a wonderful time exploring who this guy was. He was Russian, he was Jewish, he left Russia to avoid anti-Semitism and went to Germany in 1904, which was a very good move academically and a very bad move in terms of avoiding anti-Semitism. He became head of one of the leading high-tech firms of the world, Zeiss, and was kidnapped by Nazi thugs and was lucky to escape with his life and became a refugee in Palestine. And I got to know his son and his daughter and his son-in-law, and I interviewed people who'd worked with him. And anyway, so that's the origin of Goldberg. His career was ruined, although he started a new career developing the high-tech industry in Israel, actually. And other people took credit for his work, but he was forgotten. So he had no influence on the field. And very few knew about it, although he did publish in English and German about it, and he got a patent, a US patent too. But he called it a statistical machine, and nobody thought a statistical machine would be an information retrieval device, and so almost nobody noticed.
So that machine, Goldberg, was called a statistical machine?
Well, that was the terminology at the time, because the obvious use was to find business records, invoices, and payments, and data.
It had got a US patent too, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Bush discovered this, and Bush's attempt to patent his unsuccessful version. Goldberg's system did work, and Bush's didn't, and that's another whole long story.
Okay.
It's a terminological issue. Anyway, talking about moving right along to institutions and technologies, you invited me to talk about the influence of technology.
Yeah.
And this is very interesting. And one aspect that I found helpful is that when people in information science talk about information technology, they limit themselves essentially to digital computers and networks, communications networks like the internet. Now, that's a very narrow focus, because paper, the affordances of paper have had a huge impact on how libraries have developed. And what people forget is that in the first half of the century, the 20th century, photography had a huge impact because photography allowed photocopying. And around the early 1900s, they developed a process known as photostat, which was hard copy, accurate, reliable, cheap photocopy on paper. And for bulk, you could use microfilm, and microfilm was cheap, also cheap, accurate, compact, save the storage. 50-year run of a newspaper is a lot smaller when it's on microfilm, and you don't need to bind it. And you can transport it, just put it in an envelope, regular mail.
Yes.
So microfilm was understood to be hugely important. As a matter of fact, the characteristics of microfilm are almost exactly the same as the impact of computers in terms of being able to get a snippet of something quickly from somewhere, or for transferring large files. And actually that was noticed in the 30s, but wasn't widely discussed. So I found it quite helpful to think in terms of the affordances of paper and microfilm and computing. And the most basic intellectual thing is comparing. So I found it quite helpful to compare those three rather than just narrowly focus on computers. You can't understand anything if you focus only on it. You have to compare it in relation to other things. And I found that quite helpful. And you pointed out that libraries will have a challenge with big data. Well, sure. But they had a challenge with big paper.
Yeah.
They had a challenge with big microfilm, vast quantities, microfiche and microfilm, and the problems of finding stuff on it. So the libraries have survived that. So I think they'll survive other things. And what it means is that the processes, the technology, need to follow the purpose and the circumstances. And I think that part of the problem in certainly the first half of my career was that the technology of libraries had been amazingly stable for nearly a century, based on the properties of a catalog card. Very little changed in nearly a century. And when you have a very, very stable technology, a stable means, you tend to forget the difference between the means and the ends. It doesn't matter anymore, you see. If you want more of the ends, you just do more of the means. And just mindlessly doing more of the means gives you more of the ends. Simple. The problem is if some different alternative means, some alternative process comes over the horizon. And it's only human to see that as a threat. Because if you haven't distinguished clearly in your mind between means and ends, a new means will feel like a threat to your ends, if you follow me. And I think that explains part of the resistance to the introduction of computers. The other part is that abandoning technology and trying new, relatively untested ones is dangerous. It's irresponsible. If you don't understand what you're doing, you really shouldn't do it, not if other people will bear the consequences. And in any case, as Fairthorne said, you shouldn't simply automate what exists. He said, if you do that, it would be like designing a steam locomotive to run on legs. You have to go with the flow of the characteristics and affordances of the new technology. So that's yet another reason to step back and think what you're doing. Now, this ties back to information as thing, because by focusing on the concept of a document, it's a sort of clearer way of focusing on the particular medium. And there is, I think, a very rich consequence of this. I mean, the iconic example is Suzanne Brillet and saying an antelope is a document. It goes back to the Latin origin of the word. Docio means to teach or to learn from, and ment just means a thing. So a document means something you learn from or something that teaches you. And if you're interested in antelopes, there's nothing like inspecting a new one to learn a little more about the nature of antelopes. You've learned from it. So it's a document. It's a very valid thing, even though people find it startling. And then you get into the difference between the document and descriptions of the document and all sorts of stuff like that, which we don't need to get into. But this emphasis on document has had interesting consequences. The Proceedings of the Document Academy had a special issue on a paper by Robert Pages, who was a student of Suzanne Brier's about a year or two ago. And the best treatment of it is by a book by Bernd Frohman, Deflating Information, when he says the whole field of library and information science has got it wrong. I'll come back to that later. And Ron Day has been writing on this, and I have too. And also Niels Lund started a new library school and called it an Institute for Documentation Studies, which was regarded as very retro at the time. But the emphasis on documents has different origins. And one of the sources is history. If you look at historiography or the philosophy of history, the most interesting development in the last century was the rise of a style of history known by the journal they created called the Annales. The Annals.
Annals, yeah.
History. It was a bunch of young French historians who said dependence on the German style of only accepting certified, authentic written documents as evidence and nothing else, it's stupid. It's stultifying. You should regard absolutely anything as evidence and infer what you can from it. Radical change. That was the direct inspiration for Niels Lund. He was Danish and he went to Paris and studied with these historians. That's his direct connection. And I believe, I don't have the evidence, but it is thought by me and others that Suzanne Brier was influenced by the Annales historians. At least it makes sense. But another source is social studies of science. You know, people have a very artificial view of science as a pure philosophical activity. But if you actually visit a lab and see the scientists are behaving like teenagers, it's not so tidy. And so there's a field of science of science or social science of science or the study of scientific practice. And this was the resource that inspired Bernd Frohman's book on deflating information. And also, because people who call themselves information science or library and information science, desperately trying to be scientific as if they were dealing with physics, there's been an appalling lack, not only of interest in history and theory, but also a failure to address the cognitive side outside of computing ideas. And you've got the whole area of what's referred to as phenomenology, hermeneutics. And that's about how people interpret things. How do they make sense of things? And it arises out of the humanities, the deep humanities, especially interpretation of ancient religious texts. What it means is that just as beauty is in the eye of the beholder, information is in the eye of the beholder. It's not the painting behind you that is information, it's your thinking about it. Information in that sense is in the eye of the beholder, what you make of it. And different people will necessarily make different things of the same object or
Like,
nothing.
if I may interrupt, exactly the same thing I have used about my work on relevance. Relevance is in
Yes,
the eye of the beholder rather than in the painting or the document. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm proud of you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
I was going to add, the same applies. Relevance is in the eye of the beholder. There's no such thing as relevance. There is an activity in the mind. And the same with information, I would add.
Just one more thing to intervene, sorry. You mentioned about the origin of the word document and then its adoption, etc. If I may add, is it because the original meaning of the word document was lost in translation when it was adopted in English language? Would you think so? My question was
uh, I,
whether the original meaning of the word document when it was used in English language was lost rather than it became just a record rather than the learning object. Yeah.
yes, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, you can find that it had a richer past. And it has come to mean written documents on paper,
Yeah.
especially manuscript, especially legal ones. It's narrowed, and that's unfortunate.
Okay.
Now, this has another interesting, all this has another interesting consequence that one could look at mischievously, because if you ask people what's scientific about information science, they'll say, well, bibliometrics and information retrieval evaluation. But if you actually look at those fields, you'll find they're quantitative, they're amazing, they're complex, sophisticated, even useful. But the one thing they're not is scientific, because it depends on untenable assumptions. It's pseudoscience, if you really want to be rude. Doesn't mean to say it's not a good idea, and it does not say it isn't useful. But if you look at the assumptions made, it's at best engineering, not science. And related to this is that you asked about what I thought about metadata and information retrieval.
Yeah.
I've come to realize that really I regarded metadata in the wrong sense. I mean, most people think of metadata as about a document, you see. It's looking towards the document, but it isn't.
Mhm.
The word about means outside, out and about. Metadata does not refer to the document. It refers to other things that the document resembles.
Mhm.
So metadata is outward looking. It says, well, this book is by the same author as that book. So you ought to worry about that author. And it's on the same topic as this one. So you need to think of it in relation to that one. And it's from the same period as this one over here. So what metadata does, it establishes the context. Metadata is outward looking. Metadata is about context. And then if you have a look at information retrieval, consider the celebrated notion of the needle in the haystack. Okay, so that's what people think about with
Yeah.
information retrieval. They think that information retrieval systems retrieve the needle from the haystack, but it doesn't. What it does is it assembles a small number of possible needles in a pincushion and presents that the retrieved set as a set of candidate needles, a small set in a pincushion, and then whoever's the reader, the potential reader, the searcher is, can decide whether one or any or none of these potential needles is actually a needle or an interesting needle, and so on. So what follows from that is we should regard retrieval as context engineering. It's not actually about the document. It's about the context of the document. It's about generating new contexts that people can deal with. Always in the last resort, you pick from a small selection. The system develops the small selection. You pick or not from it.
So that's how the metadata ties in with information retrieval, right? Because your definition of metadata is it expands
Yes.
outside of
Yes,
the.
that's right. That's right. That ties together metadata.
Yeah.
And so then you want to talk about libraries and ideology, and the question that arises from all this interesting stuff is why bother? Why do we bother? I mean, library services are an investment. It requires talent and money and space. And you don't invest if you don't have a purpose. There's no neutrality in library land. There's purpose. And purpose depends on your values. If you want good science, you want a good science library. You only invest in a good science library if you want good science or science education. And if you want a knowledgeable, competent population, rather than an ignorant, incompetent population, well, you'd better get good school libraries and good public libraries. On the other hand, if you don't want that, if you're an authoritarian regime, you're going to ban books and you're going to cut back library funding. I mean, think of Orwell's 1984 or the activities of the present US government to see that. If, on the other hand, you are dedicated to a liberal democracy, then you're going to have liberal library services, lots of it. And this is part of a neglected area of why do libraries differ? Why are academic libraries different from special libraries, different from public libraries, from school libraries? And why do they differ in different countries? Well, it's because information science is cultural engagement. And so it depends on the cultural context. And so my most recent book was my attempt to sort of wrestle with these issues. It was called Libraries and Ideology. I thought that might attract attention as a title. I think titles sell books. And it's 3 case studies. And the first case study is the progressive, I use the word carefully, progressive modernist political agenda at the beginning of the 20th century in a case study of the development of free public libraries in the counties of California. It's actually a gem of scientific management applied. And you can just sort of hear them talking, public libraries as an engine for social progress. It's a heroic story, it really is. American library history is concentrated on the East Coast, and so they've missed out on the West Coast, unfortunately. And then the second one is the propaganda use of libraries. The propaganda sounds like a bad thing, but I'm using it neutrally. It's the attempt to influence. Rhetoric. It's a form of rhetoric. And this was used in the run-up to the Second World War. It was used during the First World War with great effect by starting free public libraries in Latin America because they wanted Latin American countries to be sympathetic to the US. And they abolished it as un-American activity, and then they picked it up again in the run-up to the Second World War because they didn't want South American countries aligning themselves with Germany. So they started public libraries all over Latin America. And then during the war, and especially during the Cold War, there were just great programs. The British Council did the same thing.
Mm.
I mean, in my lifetime, the British Council libraries in India, I went to one in Delhi.
Yeah.
Wonderful. The best place to be if you were a student in Delhi or a journalist would be the American Library
Yeah, true that.
or the British Council Library. That's the best service you could get if you could get in. It all died at the end of the Cold War, unfortunately. The motivation wasn't there by the government. And then the third case, which derives from that, was the cultural clash in the occupation of Japan at the end of the Second World War, where Japan had this deep militaristic, imperialistic, fascist political regime for decades, appalling to have lived under. And now you've got an occupation army that's dedicated to Western liberal democracy, at least in theory. And so Japanese libraries were nowhere. There wasn't any decent infrastructure. There wasn't any decent education for librarians, and there really was pitiful public libraries. And so some people, including some from my own school, got engaged in trying to bring Western liberal public libraries to Japan. And I got involved with the man who went to start the first college-level library school in Japan after the Second World War, and it sort of grew on me. Well, I've talked about information and power. And so just quickly,
Sorry, can I interject a bit? Because you talked about information as power and cultural engagement, etc., and also propaganda. In the current context, usually misinformation or disinformation is being used. I mean, it's becoming a crisis. Would you
oh
consider
yes, yes,
it's a
yes,
crisis? So it's similar to that, right? It's an extension of the same propaganda being
yes,
extended through misinformation and disinformation, right?
yes. And ideas do change over time as what's misinformation and what disinformation, isn't it? An example I used in one of my books was that at the time of in the Middle Ages, you could tell whether a woman was a witch by dumping her into a water. And if she floated, she was a witch. And if she didn't float, she drowned, but she wasn't a witch. Nobody now would think that that's good information, but it was believed then, or at least it was claimed then. So coming back to the schools, the information schools, I was expressly recruited to facilitate this transformation. And I think that the move to schools of information was inevitable for several reasons. One is, and I speak in terms of research universities are supposed to be think tanks. And so every department is expected to be a think tank. Now, you don't usually say it in those terms, but that's the reality. And Berkeley is a good example. It's a brutal environment academically. You don't get in unless you've got promise, and if you don't perform, you're out, or you don't get merit increases. Every department should be a think tank. And professional schools can forget that because there's an insatiable pressure to teach useful stuff. But you've got to be a think tank too. And a department that fails to do that is likely to be closed. Secondly, the rise of digital computing, the implications of that. I mean, it's taken a very long time to work through that, and it's going to. And you sort of have to do it in two stages. You have to first find a way to do the same things better, safely. Then you need to do better things differently. First, the same things. And then once you've made that stage, you explore the potential of the technology to do better, different things. It's wise not to try to do both at the same time, I think. And then there's the issue of library-like activities and services outside the libraries needing a lot of attention. So there's actually another one. The issues that libraries get involved in with censorship and education and so forth and politics, they're actually interesting topics that people who are not librarians can get engaged with. And I sort of had a double dose of this because after I had been dean for 6 years, I was asked to help out the system-wide administration of the University of California with its 100 libraries and 9 campuses. The coordinator for library policies and planning, who was also building ambitious online catalog that was way ahead of anything that existed. He quit, and they needed somebody to fill in for lots of different reasons. And so I agreed to fill in, and I found it so interesting that I gave up deaning to concentrate on being a library bureaucrat, planning bureaucrat. And the late 70s and the early 80s were really a very pivotal period, even more than most. I mean, every period's a period of change, but that really was when people began to think through the implications of digital technology and communications. So I had to think about that. It was a terrible job and very bad for the body and the soul, but it was fascinating while it lasted. So I've talked a bit about the iSchool movement. I've got a sort of ambiguous position on this. I've not at all been involved with the iSchool movement or the iSchool caucus, but I have been very deeply concerned and worried about the development of schools of information. It really was it was a elitist marketing ploy, the iSchool formal movement. And then it became fashionable as other schools wanted, me too, I want status. But I won't say about it. What I have done is worry a lot about the prospects of schools of information. I do think the trend is inevitable and reasonable and good, but I worry that the schools have been opportunistic and they've been successful so far. But opportunism is not enough. And I've always worried, ever since I became dean long ago, the lack of apparent strategic thinking. Now, I've had a lot of discussion. I've discussed this a lot with Vivian Petrus, who's the head of the iSchool at Humboldt University in Berlin, the former University of Berlin. And she published an article nearly a year ago on the identity of information science. What kind of animal are we talking about? And that has been astoundingly popular. 6,000 downloads the last time I looked in a matter of months. And she concludes, and this is very much my thinking too, it's a field, it's an area. And you better be very careful when you talk about disciplines, because university politics are based on disciplines, and that's a loser's game if you are dealing with anything interesting and complicated. I feel very strongly that the justification for a school of librarianship or an information school is because it matters. It matters because you don't want an ignorant society. Do you want a car repair mechanic who doesn't have the manuals? Do you want a dentist who doesn't know what they're doing? I don't think so. Do you want a medical doctor who's out of date on the cures? I don't think so. Do you want politicians making decisions in ignorance of the facts? I don't think so. It's dangerous to be surrounded by ignorant people. So that's why these schools matter.
Okay.
And if you engage in discussion of discipline, you lose that advantage, you give it away. And even worse is to talk about being interdisciplinary, because that's a sort of gap between other people. That's rhetorically, that's the weakest possible stance to take. I hate it. Methodological versatility. That's what you need. Methodological. And the punchline is this: disciplines have boundaries, scholarship doesn't. That's the thing to do.
So it should be unbounded scholarship. Information science should be an unbounded scholarship, would you call it?
If you want to be a good scholar, you pursue scholarship, and that takes you wherever you need to do, and you use whatever methodology works is the right one.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are the options? I mean, what are the strategic options and for schools of information? And there's not even a terminology for this. So Vivian Petrus and I have been working on this, and we're working on a paper. We've come up with 5. Well, the number keeps changing, but one of them is a functional approach. This is what we did at Berkeley. It's economies of scope, technically. If you're going to have a program for records management and a program for archives and a program for museum curators or registrars, it's cheaper to do them together. So you can share some courses and have economies of scale there, and you have separate courses for where they're different. So that's a functional approach. Another is people who say, well, we just find great minds. Now, most heads of school won't actually admit that, but there's a disease of hiring great minds to get a great department, and it's very dangerous. You end up with expensive extinct volcanoes, and you can't cover the curriculum, the programmatic disaster. That's bad. Another is what we call intersectional, and this has arisen with user studies, user experience, and informatics, where they say, well, you know, where the social meets the technical, and iSchools are just the place for that. It's true, it is. But that's only a little piece of the whole. And that's true of every department that uses any kind of technology. So it's incomplete, massively incomplete as far as we're concerned. And it means we're nothing special, because that should be everywhere. The fact that it is true, notwithstanding. And then another one is concentration. And currently that means you back off trying to generalize, and you retreat. You either you decide we're going to be the world's best school of librarianship, and that's it. That's a very valid choice. Or you can say, you know, we've spread too thin, we're going to reconcentrate. The LIS forward movement, that's a reactionary move of this kind. It may be a wise thing to do, but that's what it is. Or a very prevalent affliction is the notion of a self-evident good. Well, we're a school of librarianship. I mean, obviously we're needed. I mean, that's good for reassuring oneself, but it doesn't go very well with accountants and budget people. As to the future, I'm sort of optimistic, because the problems we address are too important. They're also too interesting to neglect. But the corollary of that is we'd better be attacking important questions, not trivial ones. You really have to address important problems, not easy ones. That's difficult, but that's what matters, and that's survival. And it matters how elegantly we do it. And I think we need to build on the LIS tradition. And I do worry that iSchools are forgetting their origins in the organization and access aspect. That's much less addressed now than it used to be. The marking and the parking. And then finally, coming back to information as thing, it follows from these areas I've talked about that if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, information is in the eye of the beholder, and relevance is in the eye of the beholder, it follows from that there is no such thing, material thing, as information. And the field, Paul Otley was very vocal about it, but the field doesn't think that way because it's so contaminated with figurative language. You talk about content that can be poured from one container to another. That's how people talk about information. And they talk about information as stuff. And it's nonsense, actually. And if you work through it. So I think there's a fundamental, almost Copernican change coming to the field. It's a bit like Copernicus saying, no, the sun does not revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. And I think that document theory, which is one of the very few interesting intellectual movements in our field, is leading to that kind of transformation.
So document is the sun around which the field has to move. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that we're in for, there is a need. And I think that the way we view information has to be changed and will change in a very radical way. Now, how far that will affect practice is another matter, but in terms of thinking about it. So there's lots to be done. I don't know whether I mentioned it. I came into this field because when I was a teenager, my parents kept asking me what I was going to do when I grew up. Now, being English, I didn't want to grow up, and I certainly didn't want to discuss what I would do when I grew up. They imagined some professional role as a lawyer or an accountant or something. So I thought, well, if I give them an answer, any answer at all, they'll stop asking and I'll be spared. And we live next to a public library, and I thought public libraries are socially beneficial and maybe they're pleasant places to work. So I said, well, I'm going to be a librarian until I think of something more interesting to do. And 70 years later, that's still my position.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, for this wonderful, insightful interaction. Okay. Thank you very much.